The Elder Scrolls has some of the deepest, most layered world building in all of gaming, and a huge chunk of it straight up doesn't make sense. That's not a criticism. That's actually the point. The people who build this world, specifically the writers at Bethesda, and a guy named Michael Kirkbride, who could charitably be described as a genius, and less charitably as someone writing fantasy lore after drinking a bottle of bourbon alone in a room, they deliberately built contradictions into the lore, not out of laziness. Out of this almost philosophical belief that a world this old, this layered, this full of gods and monsters and people who lie constantly should feel inconsistent, should feel like real history. Because real history is contradictory. Real history is written by people with agendas. So what we're going to do today is pull on every thread we can find. We're going to go through the lore that breaks itself, the retcons that are somehow canon, the characters who exist in two places at once, and the stories that, the deeper you dig, the less they make any sense at all. And by the end of it, you're going to understand the Elder Scrolls in a way that most people never get to, because you're going to understand that the contradictions aren't the cracks in the foundation. They are the foundation. Also, this video has a lot of pretty niche lore, and it is possible I get something wrong, so if there is anyone here who finds a mistake, please put it in the comments. I did my best though. Also, another shout out to Derico, aka Hopeless Noob, for sending in today's gameplay. If you also play any Elder Scrolls games and want your gameplay featured in a video, you can use the form in the description. We start with the most visible crack in the whole thing, and the way Bethesda tried to fix it tells you everything you need to know about how Elder Scrolls lore actually works. When the Elder Scrolls first started building out a picture of Tamriel, Cyrodiil, the Central Province, the seat of the Empire, the place Oblivion is set, was described as a tropical jungle. The Pocket Guide to the Empire, a lore document first published alongside Redguard in 1998, whose text also appears as findable books within the games Morrowind and Oblivion, described Cyrodiil in terms that could not be clearer. Most is endless jungle, enclosed by an equatorial rainforest, a river-based society surrounded by dense vegetation. A book called Provinces of Tamriel, findable in both Morrowind and Oblivion, used almost identical language. A Colovian soldier in Redguard complained about the jungle-like climate of Nibelheim. Multiple early lore sources painted this picture of a central province that was basically a fantasy version of Central America, steaming and ancient and overgrown. Then Oblivion came out in 2006, and players walked out of the sewers and into a province that looked absolutely nothing like that. Rolling green hills, temperate forests, an almost English countryside feel. There were no jungles, there was no hint of what had been described. And players immediately noticed, because Elder Scrolls fans are the kind of people who read every in-game book and cross-reference it with dialogue from a character who shows up for 30 seconds in one quest. So Bethesda had a problem, and the way they addressed it was genuinely remarkable. The answer they gave, and this answer shows up in dialogue in Oblivion and Skyrim, scattered across books and NPC lines, is that Tiber Septim changed it. Not in the sense that he ordered a bunch of deforestation, in the sense that Tiber Septim, after achieving a state of cosmic transcendence called Kim, literally altered the nature of Cyrodiil through sheer divine will. And not just in the present, retroactively, through time. He didn't change Cyrodiil from a jungle into a temperate forest in his lifetime. He changed it so that Cyrodiil had never been a jungle, rewriting its history from the inside. This is the part where you have to slow down, because what's being claimed here is absolutely wild. The text that forms the backbone of this explanation is a piece called From the Many-Headed Talos, written by Michael Kirkbride as an out-of-game lore document, the same way Nuhata was. The second paragraph of it shows up directly in Skyrim as the sermon that Heimskr delivers in Whiterun, making it one of those Kirkbride texts that straddles the line between official and unofficial. In it, Tiber Septim speaks to his legions about Cyrodiil and says, roughly, that he can see how they hate the jungle, and that he breathes now in royalty, and that he will reshape this land. And the word royalty there is a translation of a word from the ancient language of El-Nofex, and that word in the original is Kim. He's saying he's achieved Kim, and he's using that power to change the land. The commentaries on the Mysterium Xarxes, written by the Oblivion villain Mankar Camoran, include a line that says, "Kim, those who know it can reshape the land. Witness the home of the Red King once jungled." That's a direct in-universe source stating explicitly that Tiber Septim used Kim to de-jungle Cyrodiil. So the question naturally becomes, what is Kim, and why does having it let you retroactively change a continent's climate through time? To answer that, you have to go deeper than the games themselves are willing to go. Kim is a concept that gets referenced in Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim, and it never gets explained cleanly in any of them. The full picture of what Kim is supposed to be comes from a patchwork of in-game texts, developer statements, and the extremely dense philosophical writings that Michael Kirkbride produced during his time at Bethesda and afterward. The foundation of it starts with a cosmological concept that runs through the whole franchise. Everything in the Elder Scrolls universe exists within a kind of dreaming mind. At the absolute top of the metaphysical hierarchy sits an entity called the Godhead. Not a god in the traditional sense, not something you can meet or talk to, but something more like a consciousness within whose dream the entire universe exists. The Aedra, the Daedra, the mortal races, the continents, the stars, all of it is a dreamed construct within the awareness of this entity. Tamriel is a thought. History is a thought. You, as a player character, are a thought that a thought is having. Kim is what happens when a mortal within that dream becomes aware of the dream. They see the structure of reality from the inside. They see that they are a character in a story, that their existence is contingent on the dreaming of something vast and beyond comprehension. And when most mortals have that realization, the result is annihilation. They understand that they don't truly exist in any independent sense, and so they cease to exist. They zero out. This is called zero-summing. The few beings who achieve Kim are the ones who have that exact realization, who see themselves as fictional within a greater narrative, and who respond not with despair, but with the absolute certainty that they still exist, that even within a dream, their will is real, their identity is real. They hold onto the self while simultaneously understanding the self is a construct, and in doing so, they transcend both options. They neither accept the fiction uncritically nor dissolve into it. They simply are, with full knowledge. And the practical result of that state, according to the lore, is that the person becomes capable of altering reality. Because reality, being a dream, can be edited by someone who understands they're in it. Only two beings in the lore are confirmed to have achieved Kim. The first is Vivek, the warrior poet god of Morrowind, and we'll get to him in a moment because his whole situation is its own catastrophe of contradictions. The second is Tiber Septim, who used it to change Cyrodiil. And the thing about Kim being retroactive, the thing where he didn't just change the present but reached backward through time so that the jungle had never existed, makes a certain kind of sense within this framework. Because if reality is a dream and you can edit the dream, the timeline is just another piece of text you can rewrite. But here's the problem that immediately follows from this. ESO, the Elder Scrolls Online MMO, is set in the Second Era, roughly 250 years before Tiber Septim is even born. And in ESO, Cyrodiil isn't a jungle either. It looks basically the same as it does in Oblivion, temperate, rolling, unjungled. So if Tiber Septim retroactively changed Cyrodiil through time, the Second Era should show his changes. And it does, which is either confirmation that his scheme worked exactly as advertised, or, and this is what a significant portion of the lore community thinks, It's just Bethesda making an artistic choice to keep Cyrodiil consistent across games without rebuilding an entirely different looking version of the province, and then the Kim explanation is a post hoc justification. The ESO developer team actually addressed this at one point, stating that the original Endless Jungle description in early lore was simply a transcription error in the in-universe document that described it, meaning the author of that in-universe pocket guide just got it wrong. This directly competes with the Tiber Septim Kim explanation. Both explanations are out there, they contradict each other. The game has not settled which one is true, and this is, deliberately, how Elder Scrolls lore works. The unreliable narrator is baked into the architecture. The jungle problem is also, in a way, self-defeating as a plot hole. Because if Tiber Septim used Kim to change Cyrodiil retroactively, then historical documents describing Cyrodiil as a jungle shouldn't exist, because he would have changed the past such that no one ever experienced the jungle in the first place. But those documents do exist. Books within the games describe the jungle. So, either the Kim retcon didn't work cleanly, or the ESO team's transcription error answer is closer to the truth, or the whole thing is just a retcon and the in-universe explanation is cover for a production decision. And you can pick whichever one you like, and the lore will not stop you. And Tiber Septim himself, the man at the center of the whole jungle problem, has his own identity crisis that makes the geography argument look simple. Tiber Septim is the most important figure in Elder Scrolls history. The entire Third Empire is built on his legacy. He's worshipped as the divine Talos, the ninth god in the Imperial Pantheon. He's the guy whose existence causes the central political conflict of Skyrim, since the Talmorban worship of Talos and the Stormcloaks essentially revolt partly in his name. His divine blood is required to open the portal in Oblivion's main quest. He is, across the series, treated as an unambiguous god of enormous significance, so it should be simple to say who he was, right? Where he was born, who his parents were, what his real name was before he started going by Tiber Septim. It is absolutely not simple. It is a complete mess. The most widely cited mortal identity for Tiber Septim is a man named Hjalti Earlybeard. That's a Nord name. Multiple sources support that Tiber Septim was, in his mortal life, a Nord, or at least raised among Nords. His actual birthplace is listed in different sources as both the continent of Atmora, the ancient homeland of men north of Tamriel, and the island kingdom of Alcair in High Rock, which is a Breton-occupied province. Being born in High Rock would make him Breton, or at minimum half-Breton. His name Hjalti sounds Nordic, but the location of Alcair is Breton. So even his ethnicity is a point of genuine lore debate, but the birthplace thing is actually the tamest part of the Tiber Septim identity crisis. In the Third Era, an anonymous document circulated that came to be known as the Arcturian Heresy. This text, written from an opposing perspective to the official imperial hagiography of Tiber Septim, makes a specific and deeply uncomfortable claim. Tiber Septim didn't become Tiber Septim alone. He became Tiber Septim through a complex collaboration and eventual betrayal involving two other major figures. The first is Weismir Wulfharth, an ancient Nord king and Stormcaller who had been killed and resurrected multiple times, who by the time Tiber Septim was rising to power existed as a semi-divine being called the Underking. Wulfharth is a dragonborn, just like the player character in Skyrim. He can shout, he can command storms. He despises the Dunmer gods with an obsession bordering on madness. The second is Zurin Arctus, the Imperial Battle Mage. Pragmatic, politically savvy, the person who actually crowns Hjalti as Tiber Septim after the murder of King Culcain of Falkreath, the man who had been on the verge of becoming emperor before Hjalti had him killed. The Arcturian Heresy claims that Hjalti, Wulfharth, and Arctus were all working together during Tiber Septim's conquest of Tamriel, and that their collective effort Yalti's dragonborn power, amplified by Wulfharth's storms, guided by Arctus's political genius, is what made the conquest possible. The myth of Tiber Septim as a singular supreme leader was partly construction. The Tiber Septim of legend was three people pretending to be one. Then, according to the heresy, Tiber betrayed Wulfharth and Arctus both. Wulfharth had already left Tiber Septim in disgust when the armistice with Morrowind was signed, rather than an all-out invasion of Dunmer territory, which was the one thing Wulfharth had wanted above all else. So Tiber sent word that he had changed his mind, that the tribunal campaign was back on. Wulfharth returned on that promise and walked straight into an ambush. Imperial guards held him while Arctus used a soul gem to capture Wulfharth's heart. Wulfharth's soul went into the gem, which would go on to become the Mantella, the power source for the giant brass god called Numidium. But as Wulfharth's soul was being drawn out, the energy tore a hole through Arctus's chest, killing him. Tiber strolled in and collected the gem. Wulfharth reverted to ash. Arctus was dead. And then, later, after Numidium finished its conquest of Somerset Isle, a rotting undead wizard appeared in the skies and destroyed the machine. The heresy implies this was Arctus, returned as the new Underking, taking over the title that Wulfharth had held. And here's where the Elder Scrolls lore starts doing something it does constantly. It takes a story that's already confusing and makes it theologically dense. Because the community's analysis of this, supported by certain developer statements and by the deeper metaphysics of the setting, suggests that Yalti, Wulfharth, and Arctus were not just three historical figures. They were three aspects of the same mythic pattern, the same divine role, playing out an ancient story called the Enantiomorph. The Enantiomorph is a recurring pattern in Elder Scrolls cosmology. Three figures: the rebel, the king, and the observer. The rebel kills the king in the presence of the observer, and in doing so, the rebel becomes the new king. It's happened at the creation of the universe. It happened at the Battle of Red Mountain, and according to this reading, it happened again with Tiber Septim's rise, with Hjalti as the rebel, Wulfharth as the king he betrayed and consumed, and Arctus as the observer who bore witness and was forever changed. The result was not just the creation of an empire, it was the creation of a new god. The soul of Wulfharth trapped in the Mantella, the soul of Arctus frozen in undeath, and the spirit of Hjalti, all three together, eventually coalesced into the divine Talos. This means that when Nords in Skyrim pray to Talos, they are technically praying to a god made of three people, one of whom was possibly Breton, one of whom was the ancient king of the Nords, and one of whom was an imperial battle mage who was killed as collateral damage in a trap his own emperor set for someone else. And the whole thing is framed by an obscure document whose reliability is explicitly questioned by characters within the game. Whether or not this is the true history of Tiber Septim is deliberately left open. The official imperial history says he was a great man who rose to power through heroism and divine right. The Arcturian heresy says he was an ambitious general who murdered his allies and built his legend on their bones. Depending on which sources you trust, and every source in the Elder Scrolls has an agenda, you get a completely different Tiber Septim. That's the lore at work. The Tiber Septim problem is a dispute about a person's biography. The next thing is bigger, because it's about what happens when the lore contradicts itself so badly that Bethesda invented an in-universe mechanism for all of it to be true at the same time. The Warp in the West is the name given to a 3-day period at the end of Daggerfall, the second mainline Elder Scrolls game, during which something so reality-breaking happened that scholars within the game world still can't produce a coherent account of it. In Daggerfall, the player character, an agent of the Blades, a secretive imperial organization, recovers an artifact called the Mantella. The official account says it contains the soul of Zurin Arctus, the imperial battle mage who powered it with his own life force. The Arcturian heresy says it contains the soul of Wulfharth, whose heart was torn out in a trap. Both accounts exist in the lore simultaneously, Both are contested, and the game doesn't resolve it. Either way, whoever is in there, the Mantella powers Numidium, the giant brass god. And multiple powerful factions all want it. The kingdoms of Daggerfall, Wayrest, and Sentinel, the Orsimer under Gortwog Grow-Nagorm seeking recognition for the orcs, the Blades acting for the Empire, and Manimarco, the king of worms, seeking his own apotheosis. At the end of the game, the player gives the Mantella to one of those factions. That faction uses Numidium. And Numidium is used to reshape the political landscape of the Iliac Bay region in their favor. There are 6 or 7 possible endings, depending on who you give it to. Each one results in a radically different outcome for the region. Morrowind was the next game in the series, and it's set after Daggerfall, so it had to account for the political state of the Iliac Bay going forward. Bethesda's solution was extraordinary. They made all the endings canon at the same time. This is the warp in the West. In Morrowind and later in Oblivion, there's an in-universe book called, fittingly, The Warp in the West, and it documents the event from the perspective of confused historians who simply cannot understand what happened. Multiple factions all simultaneously gained control of Numidium. Multiple armies were seen in multiple places at the same time. Whole days went missing in people's memories. Lands were burned and healed at the same time. The event lasted, objectively, 3 days, but within those 3 days, enough history happened to fill several lifetimes. When it was over, all 6 factions had achieved at least part of what they wanted. The Warp in the West is the only plausible historical account of events that no one can actually explain. The in-universe reason for this is the Dragon Break. A Dragon Break is what happens when Akatosh, the dragon god of time, the chief of the divine pantheon, loses his grip on linear causality. Time is Akatosh's domain. The flow of past into present into future is something he maintains. When something powerful enough disrupts that flow, specifically when Numidium, a god-sized machine built on divine power, gets activated, time fractures. Multiple timelines run simultaneously. All the endings of Daggerfall happened at once, in parallel streams of causality, and then, when time reasserted itself and Numidium was destroyed, all those streams were compressed into a single present that incorporated elements of all of them. The practical result is that all 6 Daggerfall endings are simultaneously canon. The orcs got their recognition, Manimarco ascended to godhood, the Empire consolidated power, the individual kingdoms expanded. All of it happened at the same time, during the same 3 days. In a universe where that shouldn't be possible, the book Where Were You When the Dragon Broke collects accounts from 2 very different perspectives, and what makes it such a singular piece of Elder Scrolls writing is that neither can explain the same event the same way. The Khajiit account, written by Relate Har, a tender to the Mane, says his people were able to track events because moon sugar gave them the perception to watch the moons, which were the only constant while everyone else was fighting wars with phantoms and giving birth to their own fathers. An Altmeri scholar quotes the ancient Empress Hestra speaking through the Amulet of Kings, in whose oversoul the emperors remember Cyrodiil becoming an empire across the stars, while another emperor says it became an egg, and most of the rest speak in a language that can only be understood sideways. Each account is sincere, each account is incompatible with the others, and all of them are describing the same event. This is also not the only Dragon Break in the Elder Scrolls timeline. There was one at the Battle of Red Mountain, the Red Moment, during which the various conflicting accounts of what happened that day are all supposed to be simultaneously true. There may have been one during the Middle Dawn, a 1008-year period in the First Era, triggered by a fanatical sect of the Alessian Order called the Marukati Selective, who performed a ritual on the White Gold Tower trying to strip the elven aspects from the god Akatosh, and whose records became so internally contradictory that scholars in-universe still can't agree on what actually happened during those 1,000 years. The Dragon Break is the lore's answer to internal contradiction. When something doesn't add up, when accounts conflict beyond reconciliation, the answer is that causality itself broke and multiple things happened at once. It's both a brilliant world-building device and an enormous get-out-of-jail-free card. The community is genuinely divided on when it's a meaningful in-universe concept and when it's just a patch for continuity errors. The creators themselves have made it clear they're aware of this concern, and they've generally not used Dragon Breaks explicitly since Daggerfall. The Warp in the West is the last time it's been deployed as an explicit narrative device, but the concept is always there, hovering over the lore, waiting. If you want to see the Dragon Break theory under maximum strain, look at what it does to one specific character. Mannimarco is one of the most important figures in Elder Scrolls history. He's an Altmer, a high elf, who started his life as a student of the Sigic Order, an ancient and secretive organization of mages on the island of Artaeum. He became obsessed with necromancy, and by most accounts, was eventually cast out of the order, though the exact circumstances are disputed across the lore, and some sources suggest he left under pressure rather than being formally expelled. Either way, he spent the subsequent centuries building his power as the most feared necromancer in Tamriel. He's the one who created the Order of the Black Worm. He created Black Soul Gems, which allow the souls of sapient beings, people, and not just animals, to be trapped and used as magical batteries. He turned himself into the first Lich in recorded history, achieving a state of permanent undeath that gave him functional immortality. He's been a villain, a schemer, and a threat in multiple games across different eras, but Mannimarco's timeline is absolutely broken. In ESO, the MMO set in the Second Era, Mannimarco is a mortal Lich and the primary architect of an event called the Plane Meld. He tricked an emperor named Varen Aquilarios into performing a ritual with the Amulet of Kings that shattered the barriers between Nirn and Oblivion, giving Molag Bal the foothold he needed to attempt to drag Nirn into Coldharbour. What Molag Bal didn't know was that Mannimarco was never actually his servant. Mannimarco's plan was to use the Amulet of Kings to trap Molag Bal and absorb his divine essence, taking his place as a Daedric prince. The player character foils this, and Molag Bal, who had known about the betrayal all along, seizes Mannimarco's soul and drags him screaming to Coldharbour specifically to be tortured for trying to usurp his power. In Daggerfall, set in the Third Era only about 16 years before Oblivion, Mannimarco is the king of worms and one of the factions competing to control Numidium during the Warp in the West. If the player gives him the Mantella, he uses it to ascend to godhood, becoming the Necromancer's Moon, a divine body that passes between Arkai's influence and Nirn every 8 days and allows necromancers to perform rituals to create black soul gems. He becomes a god of necromancy, existing on a plane beyond mortal concerns. Then in Oblivion, set roughly 16 years after the Warp in the West, Mannimarco is the villain of the Mages Guild questline. He's a mortal Lich again. He's trying to subvert the Mages Guild from within, planting agents in its ranks, attempting to research the creation of black soul gems. He's not a god. He's dangerous, but he's a person, and the player character defeats him in combat, which you simply cannot do to a god. How are these three versions of the same character simultaneously canon? The Dragon Break answer is the one the community has largely settled on, and it goes like this. During the Warp in the West, Mannimarco split. The timeline fractured, and in one strand he ascended to godhood as the Necromancer's Moon, and in another strand he remained mortal. When time reasserted itself, both outcomes persisted in the same universe. The god Mannimarco continues to exist as the Necromancer's Moon, and the mortal Mannimarco continued walking around in Cyrodiil, weaker and stranger than before, having been partly drained by the event that elevated his other self. This is actually supported by a text written by Michael Kirkbride called Nuhata of the Sphinx Moth Inquiry Tree, an out-of-game document that the lore community treats as an authoritative developer statement on the cosmology. In it, the entity Nuhata addresses the King of Worms directly and says the Jills of Akatosh have mended this new edition and that Manimarco remains as he was, the High Priest of Maggots. The Jills are the dragon daughters of Akatosh who repair breaks in time. This line is saying that after the warp, Akatosh's agents cleaned up the dragon break as best they could, and the version of Manimarco that remained was the mortal one, stripped of the godhood that the dragon break had briefly given him. The Necromancer's moon still exists as an in-game mechanic in Oblivion, meaning the god aspect of Manimarco is still out there, blocking Arcae's influence on schedule, but the person is mortal. Both coexist. This is what the dragon break does to people. It creates parallel versions of them that then share a world. And then there's a wrinkle on top of that, because Manimarco is also claimed in the poem Manimarco, King of Worms, to be the first lich ever. But ESO, which is set centuries before that poem was supposedly written, already has numerous liches in it, beings under Molag Bal's command, independent creatures, ancient undead. The claim that Manimarco was the first lich is almost certainly not accurate in any historical sense. It's probably religious hagiography, his followers bigging him up the way followers do, or it's a retcon from ESO that contradicts earlier texts. The UESP, which is the main Elder Scrolls wiki and takes a serious scholarly approach to lore, treats it as a simple inconsistency rather than something with an in-universe explanation. Manimarco's story touches every game he's in and remains impossible to resolve into a single coherent biography. He existed for over a millennium in canonical history. He had a hand in some of the biggest events in Tamriel. And his personal timeline involves a divine split, an uncertain origin, a god that still technically exists while the mortal version was killed by a player character, and the lingering presence of his influence in games set after his death. He's a mess, and he's one of the most interesting messes in the entire franchise. Manimarco's mess is mostly chronological. The next person on this list has a mess that is spiritual, political, and involves hiding a murder confession in his own scripture. Vivec is the warrior poet god of Morrowind. In the events of the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, which is set at the end of the Third Era, Vivec is one of 3 living gods of the Dunmer people, the Dark Elves, along with Almalexia and Sotasil. He's a massive, golden figure who floats over the city that bears his name, simultaneously a divine being and an accessible presence who will meet with the player character, answer questions, and hand out artifact rewards. He is, by most accounts, one of the most compelling characters in Elder Scrolls history. He also almost certainly murdered the greatest hero the Dunmer ever had, and then wrote 36 cryptic philosophical texts about it, including a hidden acrostic message confessing to the crime, which he then distributed as his religion's sacred scripture. The history goes back to the First Era, to the Battle of Red Mountain and its aftermath. Before Vivec became a god, he was a mortal Dunmer general, serving under Lord Indoril Nerevar, the Hortator, which is the Dunmeri title for the supreme war leader and political champion. Nerevar was apparently exceptional in every way, brilliant, respected by Daedric princes, loved by his people, able to negotiate peace between the Dunmer and their rivals in ways that should have been impossible. He was also close friends with Vivec. During the fighting in the Heart Chamber, after Nerevar and Dumak both fell from their wounds, Kagrenak, the Dwemer chief tonal architect, used his tools on the heart of Lorkhan, and the entire Dwemer race vanished. This left Nerevar's side in possession of the tools Wraithguard, Sunder, and Keening, and in possession of the heart of Lorkhan itself. What happened next is the single most contested event in Elder Scrolls lore, because every account disagrees. The Dunmer Tribunal's official version, told through the voice of Vivec himself, is that Nerevar asked them to swear never to use the tools that they promised, and that after Nerevar died of his wounds from the battle, the tribunal eventually broke that oath and used the tools to draw power from the heart and become gods. Azura, the Daedric prince who had been Nerevar's patron, cursed them for the betrayal, turning the golden-skinned Chimer into the grey-skinned Dunmer. The Ashlander tradition, told by the descendants of those who were present and who didn't benefit from the tribunal's version, says something much darker. That the tribunal murdered Nerevar after he made them swear, that the betrayal wasn't breaking an oath after his natural death, but killing him specifically so they could use the tools without his objection. Vivek's own religious texts, the 36 Lessons of Vivek, which he wrote himself and distributed as scripture, don't directly address any of this. They're philosophical and mythological, describing events in symbolic, often incomprehensible language. But embedded within them are patterns that scholars both in-universe and in the real-world Elder Scrolls community have found. Taking the first letter of each paragraph in Sermon 36, the sermon describing the Battle of Red Mountain spells out the words foul murder. Vivek did that deliberately. He wrote his confession into his own holy book in a cipher across the one sermon that describes the event most directly. He told the truth and buried it where only someone looking hard enough would ever find it. There's more. In Sermon 29, Vivek listed 35 topics, each with a number beside it. Taking the words at those numbered positions across the other 35 sermons in the collection generates another hidden message. He was not born a god. His destiny did not lead him to this crime. He chose this path of his own free will. He stole the godhood and murdered the Hortator. Vivek wrote this. Vivek wrote this. He specifically tagged his own hidden confession. He wanted someone to find it. And because the 36 lessons are the sacred scriptures of the Dunmer people, millions of people in universe have been living under a religion whose foundational texts are secretly a murder confession written by the god they worship. The full scope of what Vivek was doing with those texts is still debated. Michael Kirkbride wrote them during, by his own description, a week alone with bourbon and cigarettes. Kirkbride has explicitly said that Vivek is an unreliable narrator, that some of the lessons are lies, some are deliberate misdirection, and some are genuine instructions for achieving Kim. The texts are simultaneously theological mysticism, a philosophical guide to enlightenment, an autobiography that changes its own facts depending on which version you read, and a confession that the author couldn't bring himself to simply state out loud. Vivek's Kim is also complicated. He achieved it before becoming a god, or maybe in the process of becoming one. The accounts differ. His awareness of the greater dream, of the Godhead above all things, is what allows him to communicate with players of the game in certain texts, breaking the fourth wall. There's a passage where he directly addresses the reader as someone playing a game, which is either meta-commentary from Kirkbride or a genuine fourth wall break that is itself canon to the lore. The 37 lessons, a final sermon added in ESO, contains a website URL hidden in the text, which was an actual real-world URL that led to the C0DA project, Kirkbride's post-Bethesda continuation of Elder Scrolls metaphysics. The line from Sota Sil that contains it translates to, "Go here, world without wheel, charting 0 deaths, and echoes singing." The URL is c0da.es. Vivek's lore is the most deliberately constructed maze in the whole franchise. Every path through it leads to more questions. He's the most powerful god of the Dunmer, the most prolific writer in Tamriel's history, and quite possibly the man who killed the greatest hero his people ever had, wrote it down in code, and then gave the code to his victims as a religion. Vivek's situation is a tragedy still playing out across several games. The Dwemer situation ended in a single moment, and nobody can agree on what that moment actually was. The Dwemer are the most technologically advanced civilization in Elder Scrolls history. They built underground cities so sophisticated that they're still functioning thousands of years after the Dwemer themselves disappeared. Their automatons still operate, their pipes still carry steam, their architecture still stands, and not a single Dwemer is left alive, except for one, and even he's in a terrible state. The disappearance happened at the Battle of Red Mountain in the 700th year of the First Era. During the battle, when Nerevar and Dumak both fell from their wounds in the heart chamber, Kagrenak, the chief tonal architect, struck the heart of Lorkhan with his three tools, Sundar, Keening, and Wraithguard, and immediately every Dwemer on Tamriel vanished, not just the ones at Red Mountain. Every Dwemer on the entire continent, including the Rorken clan who had refused to join the First Council when Nerevar and Dumak formed it, and had left for Hammerfell centuries before the battle ever happened. They vanished too. Whatever Kagrenak triggered, it reached every Dwemer simultaneously, regardless of distance or location. The only survivor is Yagrum Bagarn, who the player character meets in Morrowind. He was in an outer realm at the time, a plane of existence outside Nirn, and so wasn't caught by whatever happened to the rest. When he returned to Nirn, he contracted Corprus, the divine disease created by Dagoth from the power of the heart of Lorkhan, and it's slowly consuming his body. He's enormous, distorted, barely mobile. He lives in the care of Divite Fire, an ancient dark elf wizard who built the Corpusarium as both a refuge for the infected and a research facility, since he found the disease as fascinating as it was terrible. And Yagrum spends his remaining time trying to figure out what happened to his people. Yagrum offers two theories directly to the player character. The first, Kagrenak succeeded. He attached the Dwemer to the power of the heart of Lorkhan, which gave them access to divine energy, and the consequence of that access was that they were translated to another plane of existence. Much the way deities exist beyond the mortal world. They became something beyond physical. They're still there, somewhere, in a state they may or may not have intended. The second, something went wrong. Kagrenak was working from incomplete understanding. The tonal architecture required to manipulate the heart of Lorkhan is extraordinarily precise, built on specific resonant frequencies, specific sequences of sound and vibration, and getting it wrong would have catastrophic consequences. The Dwemer may have simply been destroyed by an experiment they didn't fully control, wiped from existence by the power they were trying to harness. The game Skyrim adds a third possible data point. A mage at the College of Winterhold named Arniel Gain attempts to replicate Kagrenak's experiment on a smaller scale, using a warped soul gem as a stand-in for the heart of Lorkhan and using the tool Keening to complete the ritual. When he does, he vanishes, not dies, vanishes. He becomes a shade, a spectral version of himself that the player can summon. He's not dead, he's not alive, he's somewhere else, or in a state that doesn't map cleanly onto either option. If Arniel's fate is a small-scale version of what Kagrenak did to the whole Dwemer race, then the Dwemer are somewhere undefined, in a state that's neither life nor death, waiting. The book The Egg of Time within Morrowind's lore argues that attaching a race to the heart of Lorkhan through the tools should be perfectly safe. Yagrum Bagarn explicitly says that book is wrong. The competing texts within the game itself cannot agree on whether the experiment was dangerous, and Bethesda has made clear, through years of storytelling decisions, that they intend never to answer this conclusively. The Dwemer mystery is the franchise's longest-running, most carefully preserved open question. There's a dimension to the Dwemer disappearance that makes it even stranger. The Dwemer didn't believe in gods. They were, theologically, somewhere between atheists and anti-theists. They found the very concept of divine beings, entities with intrinsic authority and power over mortals, offensive. Their whole project with the heart of Lorkhan was, on some level, a rejection of the divine order. They found the literal heart of a dead creator god and decided to use it to make themselves into gods. Not because they wanted godhood for its own sake, but because if godhood was achievable through tonal architecture and engineering, then it was never sacred to begin with. It was just technology. And technology can be democratized. A race that rejected gods tried to use a dead god's heart to transcend mortality, and they vanished, and no one can say whether it worked. At least with the Dwemer, you know something happened, and the mystery is what. With the Hist, a group of ancient sentient trees native to Black Marsh, the mystery is something else entirely. They saw a catastrophe coming centuries before it happened, told no one, and prepared for it in secret. The Argonians are the lizard people of Black Marsh, and they are strange in ways that the other races of Tamriel mostly don't understand or like to think about. Every other playable race is either a human, an elf, or an elf-descended hybrid. The Argonians are something else. They're deeply biological, amphibious, scaled, diverse in their physical traits in ways tied to which Hist tree they were born near. And the key word there is Hist. The Hist are sentient trees. They're native to Black Marsh, and they predate essentially everything else in Tamriel's history. The current understanding, supported by multiple lore sources including developer commentary, is that the Hist aren't native to Nirn at all. They exist on a plane of being that Tamriel scholars don't have full access to. They arrived in the mortal world and have been here since. They form a hive consciousness, not like a beehive, but more like a vast distributed intelligence. All the Hist trees connected through root systems and something that functions like collective memory. Their sap is literally their soul, in a very specific lore sense. A Hist sap is the substance of its consciousness, and when an Argonian drinks it, the Hist can communicate with them through visions. When Argonian eggs hatch, the hatchlings lick Hist sap. This determines their physical appearance, their sex, some of their innate traits. When an Argonian dies, their soul returns to the Hist, not to Aetherius, not to Cold Harbor, not to any of the standard afterlives, to the tree. The Hist collects the dead and holds their memories, passing them forward to future generations. The Argonians are, in a very real sense, physical extensions of the Hist's will, created by the trees to observe and experience the world from within it. This is unsettling on its own. It gets more unsettling when you look at what the Hist did during the Oblivion Crisis. Just before Mehrunes Dagon's invasion of Nirn, before the Emperor was murdered, before the first Oblivion Gate opened, before any of it became visible, the Hist trees across Black Marsh began calling Argonians home. A mass migration driven by the trees back to the province away from the Empire, and then the Hist began altering the Argonians. Using sap to physically modify their biology, faster, stronger, more aggressive, restructured for combat in ways that went beyond their already considerable natural abilities. When the Oblivion Gates opened in Black Marsh, the Argonians charged through them. They didn't just defend Black Marsh, they invaded Oblivion. Mehrunes Dagon's Daedra, who were forcing open gates to pull Nirn into the Deadlands, found themselves being rushed by armies of combat-enhanced reptile people pouring through their own portals into their own realm. The Daedric prince was forced to close the Oblivion Gates in Black Marsh himself. Not because the mortal defenders stopped the invasion on the Nirn side, but because the Argonians took the fight to Dagon's backyard and it became easier to shut the doors than deal with them. The Deadlands, part of Mehrunes Dagon's realm, reportedly still bears the scars of that campaign, and the Argonians who went through those gates when Dagon closed them were trapped on the other side with no way back. The historical records from other provinces during the Oblivion Crisis describe cities falling, provinces burning, armies overwhelmed. Black Marsh is the only province where the Daedric invasion was not just repelled but reversed, and the reason is that the Hist knew. They saw the crisis coming before any mortal did. They prepared. They physically altered a species to fight a specific war. How did they know? The lore doesn't say. The Hist operate on a timescale and with a consciousness so different from anything the mortal races understand that attempting to explain their foreknowledge with standard Elder Scrolls cosmology is probably the wrong approach. They simply knew. They're old enough and connected enough to enough planes of existence that the Oblivion Crisis was visible to them before it became visible to anyone else. After the crisis, the Argonians seceded from the Empire. A nationalist faction called the Englil came to power, governing Black Marsh with absolute insularity. No imperial authority, no imperial soldiers, no foreign presence. The Hist apparently approved. And when Red Mountain erupted in the Fourth Era and devastated Morrowind, the province whose people had enslaved Argonians for thousands of years, the Englil turned the now enhanced Argonian armies south and invaded. The sacking of southern Morrowind during what scholars call the Accession War was brutal. The Argonians got payback for centuries of slavery while their former slave masters were still dealing with a volcanic catastrophe. The Hist engineered all of it, from predicting the Oblivion Crisis to physically creating the army that would fight it to positioning that army for the Retribution campaign afterward. They're the most powerful geopolitical actor in Elder Scrolls history, and they almost never get discussed because they're trees. That's the Lord doing strange things on a continental scale. Now look at something much smaller. A farming village in Skyrim with no quests attached to it and no story reason to visit, that is somehow one of the most unsettling places in the entire game. Rorikstead is a small farming village in the hold of Whiterun in Skyrim, and it has exactly 0 quest lines associated with it. There's no main story hook, no dramatic revelation, no moment where the game pulls back the curtain and says, this is what's really going on here. You can spend 100 hours in Skyrim and never think about Rorikstead beyond briefly passing through on your way somewhere else. But if you stop and pay attention to Rorikstead, something is wrong. The fertility of the soil in Rorikstead is notable. The farmers there will tell you that the crops are good, the land is rich, and they plan to sell the fertile soil itself to other settlements because it's that valuable. This is striking because Rorikstead is in a region of Skyrim's tundra that should not have particularly fertile soil. The climate is cold, the geography is not especially suited to agriculture. But Rorikstead's crops are exceptional. When asked about it, the town's healer, a Breton named Juan Manet, gets defensive. He cites hard work and good soil and the blessings of the gods, and then specifically states that there is no secret. The way the game codes that conversation makes the no secret line feel like exactly the kind of thing a character says when they have a secret. Every house in Rorikstead has soul gems inside. Not 1 or 2. Every house. Soul gems are used in magic to trap the spirits of living creatures. There's no obvious reason for ordinary farmers in a rural community to have soul gems in their homes. Juwan's only book, his single piece of personal reading material, is a text titled Spirit of the Daedra, which is about how the Daedric princes use and harvest mortal souls, and which exists in only 2 other places in Skyrim, the College of Winterhold and the realm of Hermaeus Mora. Juwan is secretly teaching magic to a child named Sissel, and he's doing it in secret. When Sissel almost reveals this, Juwan panics and tells her to keep quiet. Specifically, he tells her not to let anyone know our secret. He's not teaching her restoration magic, which would make sense for a healer. He's teaching her water breathing and the ability to extinguish flames, spells that have nothing to do with healing. 3 women in Rorikstead have died in childbirth despite the presence of a trained healer. All 3 are the mothers of the current generation of children in the village. Juwan, who is described as saving the town founder Rorik's life in battle, was present for all 3 births. The children survived, the mothers did not. Historical records, specifically a book called Holdings of Jarl Jalund, whose age is contested even within the game, with Farengar at Dragon's Reach placing it at the First Era or possibly earlier, during the Merethic era just after the Dragon War, reference a settlement called Roriksteading in the same location where Rorikstead now stands. This means the settlement existed in the First Era. The man the town is named after, Rorik, is present in Skyrim and tells the player character that he founded the town. The first era was thousands of years ago. That timeline does not add up for a living man who fought in a relatively recent war. The Forsworn, a group of tribal Reachmen who are normally hostile to any outsider, operate camps in the Reach right along the border with Whiterun Hold where Rorikstead sits. And those camps do not appear to target the village. Lokir, the horse thief executed at the beginning of Skyrim, is from Rorikstead. He's the one who panics during the Imperial execution and runs, only to be shot by an arrow. He has no family or friends in Rorikstead. No one in the village acknowledges him. No one mentions him. There's no residence for him. He's from there, and the village acts like he never existed. There is a dragon burial mound directly outside Rorikstead. This is not unusual. Skyrim has many dragon burial mounds, but this one has offerings left on it. Someone is tending it. Someone is leaving things there deliberately. The community theory, built over years of careful observation, is that Rorikstead is a cult. That Juan and Rorik made a deal with a Daedric prince, the likeliest candidate being Clavicus Vile, who grants wishes in exchange for soul bargains, and the terms of the deal are that the women of the village periodically die in childbirth, their souls harvested for the Daedric prince, in exchange for the exceptional crop yields that keep the village wealthy. The soul gems are there to trap those souls. Juan is teaching Sissel magic so she can carry on the bargain when Juan is gone. The town has been doing this since the First Era, which is why Rorik hasn't aged, and why historical records place the settlement there thousands of years ago. Bethesda has never confirmed this. There is no quest, no dialogue, no book that says outright this is a Daedra cult. The evidence is all circumstantial, assembled from environmental details that individually have mundane explanations and collectively form something that looks like a pattern. The community has been arguing about whether there's a real secret here, or whether it's a collection of coincidences that a fandom desperate for hidden lore has assembled into a theory. But Bethesda has also never denied it, and the detail density is higher than you'd expect for a village that's supposed to be unremarkable. Rorikstead is a small-scale version of a pattern that runs through the whole franchise. The people in power have a story they want you to believe, and the evidence doesn't support it. Nowhere is that more devastating than with the Tribunal. The Tribunal, Almalexia, Sotasil, and Vivec are the three living gods of the Dunmer people in the Third Era. They ruled Morrowind for thousands of years. Their power came from Kagranak's tools and the Heart of Lorkhan, which they used to tap into divine energy after the Battle of Red Mountain. Azura cursed them for the presumption, turning the Chimer into the Dunmer, and prophesying that one day Nerevar would return, and they would face the consequences of their betrayal. The Tribunal built their entire religion around the memory of Nerevar. He's venerated as the greatest Hortator, the hero who united the Dunmer against the Dwemer, who forged the First Council, who gave his life to secure the future of his people. The Tribunal Temple, the organized religion of Morrowind, treats Nerevar's legacy as sacred. Vivec's 36 lessons repeatedly invoke Nerevar as the student, the companion, the moral counterweight to Vivec's own complicated divinity. The Dunmer people are shaped by his memory. And the most supported reading of the available evidence is that the Tribunal stabbed him to death so they could steal the tools he made them swear not to use. The hidden acrostic in Vivec's Sermon 36 says foul murder. The deeper, hidden message says they chose the path and stole godhood and murdered the Hortator. The Ashlander tradition, the oral history of the tribes who have no political investment in the Tribunal's version, says plainly that Nerevar was killed by the Tribunal. Alandro Sul, a soldier who was present at the Battle of Red Mountain and who was blinded by the shout of Wulfarth during the fight, is one of the sources for the Ashlander account, and he has no reason to invent it. Vivec's own testimony says something different. In his account, Nerevar died of wounds after the battle, before any of the tool using happened, and the Tribunal's sin was breaking the oath they swore to a dying man. But Vivek, as established, embedded a confession to murder in the same text. He cannot be trusted to tell the story accurately. His unreliability is a deliberate feature of his characterization. The Morrowind player character is the Nerevarine, Nerevar's reincarnation. The whole main quest of Morrowind involves them fighting Dagoth-Ur, destroying the heart of Lorkhan, severing the Tribunal's connection to their divine power source. By the end of the game, the Tribunal are mortal. And the events that follow, shown in the Morrowind expansions and referenced in later games, see both Almalexia and Sothasil die, Almalexia in a madness-induced violence, and Sothasil at Almalexia's hand, leaving only Vivek, who then disappeared completely before the eruption of Red Mountain that destroyed Vardenfell. Without the heart, without Vivek's power sustaining it, the Ministry of Truth, a giant rock Vivek had caught and frozen above his city using divine power, fell and struck the earth, causing a catastrophe that reshaped the landscape. The Tribunal's entire story is a tragedy built on a lie, and the lie is embedded in the religion that served as its own monument. Every story so far has been about characters within the world lying to each other. Now we need to go one level up, because the lore has a claim about the nature of the world itself that makes all of those lies look small. At the very top of the Elder Scrolls metaphysical hierarchy is the Godhead, not the Aedra, not the Daedra, not Akatosh, higher than any of that. The Godhead is the mind within which the entire dreaming of the Elder Scrolls universe takes place. Mundus, the mortal world, is a thought. Oblivion, the realm of the Daedric princes, is a thought. Aetherius, the magical outer realm from which the stars draw their power, is a thought. The whole cosmological structure, described across 30 years of Elder Scrolls lore, is a dream being dreamed by an entity so far beyond anything the lore's gods can perceive that even the gods don't know it exists. Kim, as discussed earlier, is the state of becoming aware that you're inside that dream. Most beings who achieve that awareness zero out, ceasing to exist because the realization that you're fictional is too much for a fictional being to survive. The few who hold on become transcendent. They can reshape the dream from the inside. C0DA, the post-canon project created by Michael Kirkbride, takes this further. It proposes that all versions of the Elder Scrolls story are simultaneously canon, not because of dragon breaks or in-universe paradoxes, but because every story is true within the dreaming of the Godhead. Every playthrough, every mod, every fan theory, every version of the characters anyone has ever imagined, all of it is a dream happening somewhere within the Godhead's consciousness. The practical result of this, if taken seriously as a framework, is that Thomas the Tank Engine dragons, replacing Alduin in Skyrim mods, are, technically, occurring within the Godhead's dreaming. That the version of the story where the Stormcloaks win and the version where the Imperials win both exist somewhere as true experiences. That your headcanon about what the Nerevarine did after Morrowind ended is happening in the same way anything else is happening in a universe that is fundamentally a dream. This is either the most elegant possible solution to the problem of canon in a long-running, player-driven series, or it's a complete abandonment of the concept of narrative stakes. The community is genuinely split. Many fans find it liberating, your experience of the game is valid, your choices mattered, your personal version of events is as true as anyone else's. Other fans find it actively harmful. If everything is canon, nothing is canon, and there's no way to have a meaningful conversation about what actually happened in the lore. The Godhead concept also raises a question that nobody can answer. What is the Godhead? Is it sleeping? Is it aware of what it's dreaming? Is the Godhead's dream intentional? Is the universe of the Elder Scrolls a created thing within the Godhead's consciousness? Or is the universe just happening to the Godhead the way dreams just happen to us? And if the universe is a dream, does the universe have an ending? Does it have a purpose? The only real hint comes from the concept of Amaranth, a hypothetical state beyond Kim described in certain developer texts. where Kim is the state of being aware you're in a dream and choosing to remain yourself within it, Amaranth is the state of becoming the dreamer, of ascending out of the dream entirely and taking over the role of the Godhead, of becoming the consciousness within which the next universe will exist. The person who achieves Amaranth essentially becomes a new Godhead, and their dream becomes the next Elder Scrolls universe. This is the endgame of the metaphysics, according to Kirkbride's extended writings. The whole sweep of Elder Scrolls history, the creation of Mundus, the wars of gods and men, Kim and Dragon Breaks, and the Nerevarine and the Dragonborn, is all happening within one Godhead's dream. And the purpose of all of it might be to produce a being who achieves Amaranth and becomes the next dreamer, starting the whole cycle again in a new form. Whether Bethesda has any intention of ever doing anything with this in an actual game is an open question. The games have gotten progressively less willing to engage with the deepest metaphysical layers of the lore since Morrowind. Skyrim barely touched Kim. The mainstream Bethesda approach seems to be to keep the cosmic horror of the setting's underpinnings at arm's length, letting them be there for the people who want to dig, but not foregrounding them in ways that would alienate players who just want to fight dragons. But it's there. Every time you walk through Skyrim or Morrowind or Cyrodiil, you're inside a dreamed universe, inside a larger metaphysical structure, inside a consciousness so vast it makes the Daedric princes look like ants. And the reason the lore contradicts itself, the reason Vivek confessed to murder in Code and Money Marco, exists in two states at once, and the Dragon Break makes all endings simultaneously true, is that in a dream, contradictions are not errors. They're the texture of the experience. They're the thing that makes it feel real, because real things are contradictory, and the dream knows that, and the dream builds in the contradiction on purpose. And then there's one more layer. Running quietly under everything else in the franchise's history is a concept called the Towers. And once you know about it, every catastrophe you've ever seen in these games starts to look like part of the same slow collapse. The Towers are massive structures scattered across Tamriel and beyond, each one anchoring reality in a specific way. They're not just architectural landmarks. They're metaphysical pins holding the structure of Mundus together. The concept is tied to the creation of the mortal world. When Lorkhan convinced the other gods to help make Nirn, the act of creation drained enormous amounts of their divine power. The gods who participated, who became the Aedra, lost their immortality, lost much of their autonomy, sacrificed themselves into the bones of the earth. The Towers are part of that sacrifice. Structures that maintain the stability of Mundus, that keep the mortal world from dissolving back into the chaos of oblivion, that anchor the rules of physics and time and causality. Each tower has a stone, a physical object at its heart that focuses its power. The Red Tower at Red Mountain had Lorkhan's own heart as its stone. When the heart of Lorkhan was neutralized by the Nerevarine at the end of Morrowind, the Red Tower lost its stone. Red Mountain eventually erupted catastrophically. The towers are connected to the stability of their regions. The Snowthroat Tower, Skyrim's throat of the world, has a stone that's been described as the word of the agreement between the gods that created Mundus. It's tied to the agreement itself, the covenant of creation. The Adamantine Tower in High Rock, possibly the oldest structure in the world, was built by the gods themselves during the Dawn Era. Crystal Lake Law in Somerset was the Altmer's Tower, toppled by Mehrunes Dagon's Daedra during the Oblivion Crisis. The Thalmor then falsely claimed they had secretly stopped the invasion through deep magic, and rode that lie into political control of the entire province. The White Gold Tower in Cyrodiil, the Imperial City's central structure, is a tower. The Orichalk Tower, believed to have stood on the now sunken continent of Yokuda, went down with the land when Yokuda sank beneath the sea in the First Era. Each one is an anchor point, and each one's stability matters. The problem is that towers have been falling. Crystal Lake Law is gone. The Red Tower lost its stone. The towers are not a static defensive grid, that's always going to be there. They can be destroyed, they can be corrupted, their stones can be removed. And when they fail, the region they anchored becomes more vulnerable, not just to Daedric invasion, but to metaphysical instability, to the unraveling of the rules that make mortal existence possible. Esso's plotline about the Dark Anchors, the giant chains that Molag Bal used to try to pull Nirn into Cold Harbor, was resisted in part because the towers were still standing. Had more of them fallen, the barriers would have been weaker. The towers are the reason Mehrunes Dagon's Oblivion Crisis needed to involve assassinating the Emperor and extinguishing the Dragonfires, because without those spiritual anchors down, a direct assault on the towers would have been too costly. The Oblivion Crisis was Dagon working around the tower system. The slow dissolution of the towers across Elder Scrolls history is one of the most compelling background narratives in the franchise, because it reads as a slow-motion collapse of the infrastructure of existence. The mortal world is held together by sacrifices the gods made at creation, sacrifices that are embodied in these structures, and those structures are coming down one by one across thousands of years of history. Nobody in any game addresses this directly as a plot. It's just there, in the texts, for the reader who's paying attention. So step back from all of it. Why does any of this exist? Why does Elder Scrolls lore build contradictions into itself at every level? From small anachronisms like a building named after someone who wasn't born yet, to cosmic paradoxes like a god who is two people at once. The answer, and this is something the developers have said explicitly, and something the lore itself encodes in its structure, is that Elder Scrolls treats its history the way we should treat real history. No single account of the past is complete, no narrator is neutral. Every text, every testimony, every historical record is produced by someone with an agenda, a limited perspective, an investment in a particular version of events. Vivek wrote his autobiography and hid a murder confession in it. The Empire produced records about Tiber Septim that made him into a god hero and left out the parts where he betrayed his allies and had his emperor killed. The tribunal built a religion around the man they may have murdered and then spent thousands of years pretending the murder didn't happen. The Dwemer vanished and left no one to tell their side of anything. When Bethesda made all the Daggerfall endings canon through a Dragon Break, they were doing something genuinely unusual in gaming. They were refusing to erase the player's experience. Every version of the Daggerfall story that anyone played happened. The choice mattered. And rather than pick one and call it real, they built into the lore itself a mechanism by which all of them could be true, messy, contradictory, imperfect, like history actually is. The histories knew the Oblivion Crisis was coming, and nobody else did, because they're connected to something older and larger than any civilization in Tamriel. Rorikstead might be a Daedra cult, or it might be a village with some suspicious coincidences, and the game will not tell you which, because the truth of small local histories is often unknowable. The Dwemer tried to build a god, and vanished, and you will never know for certain whether it worked, because nobody who knew the answer survived to write it down, and the one Dwemer who did survive doesn't know either. The Elder Scrolls lore doesn't make sense, and that's the point. Sense is for people who only know one version of the story. The Elder Scrolls knows all of them, and it's not going to pick.